Hello and welcome to Talking Europe. The EU is still struggling, failing even, to deal with the number of refugees arriving on its shores. Most of those people are fleeing terrorism in their home countries, notably Syria. The Netherlands recently joined coalition airstrikes aimed at the Islamic group there. The Netherlands, of course, is the country currently holding the rotating presidency of the EU, so it will be leading discussions on both these issues and indeed could be the country in control when another hot EU topic gets put to the vote, the UK membership of the Union. To give us greater insight on these issues and indeed more, we're joined by Dutch Foreign Minister, Mr. Bert Koenders. Mr. Koenders, thanks so much for your time. Now, let me start perhaps with this. I mean, it's not an easy time to be trying to run the EU as a union. The migrant crisis, we're still seeing dozens of people die almost every day on our shores. We're not living up to European values, are we? I mean, we're blatantly dropping the ball on what we believe is right.
I think European values are at the cornerstone of the way we have to look at this migration crisis. And you see that very easily we forget the debate about European values. And I think when we were talking about the banking crisis a few years ago, we had a stress test. I think we need a stress test also when it comes to the asylum seeker and migration crisis. Stress test on our values. On the one hand, it's very important that we have the hospitality to assist those people who need to be in care, who need care. On the other side, it's also the fear of many people that it's an uncontrolled asylum seekers momentum which is not easily stopped, which leads to a lot of fear and attacks. And I think we have to stand for our human rights at this point, but also understand that integration is not an easy thing. The migrants have certain rights. I think they are in international conventions. But at the same time, it's very important that also they adapt to the societies they're in.
Now, I believe the leader of your party, the Dutch Labour Party, has come up with a plan, and that would actually see the European Union sending people directly back from Greece, refugees that arrive directly back from Greece to Turkey. In exchange, the Union would take, 150, 200,000 people from Turkey to be refugees in the European Union. What's this plan about? It seems a bit counterproductive to send vulnerable people who have just managed to get to Greece alive, to send them straight back.
Look, what I think is important in these type of ideas is that people do not have to make this trip on a boat and drown. So that we kill this smuggling business plan from those who are actually helping these people. At the same time, they're drowning. So it's not a bad idea to think through how people could be staying in Turkey, and at the same time there would be a voluntary resettlement program because they wouldn't have to take those boats. And I think that's the key issue when you talk about values and human rights. This is key. And so therefore the agreement with Turkey and of course the operationalization of that is very important.
And is this plan perhaps an element on the cards or not really for the moment?
Well, I think it's not that different from what actually one is already trying to seek with the European Union and Turkey. But obviously the devil is always a little bit in the details, and it is important that then also Turkey becomes what we call a safe country. It has to adapt its laws. And of course we have to abide by humanitarian principles. At the same time, I would say there's nothing humanitarian about people being killed and drowned in boats in this.
Well, it looks like we're standing by really and watching. Now, the other solution a lot of countries are proposing, of course, is closing their borders more and more, notably putting a border on the north of Greece so that people arriving can't get further into the European Union. Where do you stand on that? I mean, is Schengen then dead? Are we going to close our natural borders?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to save Schengen. That's the most important point. Because Schengen is, you cannot simply solve the refugee crisis by closing borders. We also know at the same time that Dublin and Schengen are not working very well, so we will have to adapt it in some way or another. And therefore I think it's important that we also assist the countries in the Western Balkans when they want to work on this refugee flow in this region. And that can mean that you have registration centers also in countries like Greece and in Macedonia. I think it's good because what we want to do, obviously, is to make sure that those who have a right for asylum can move, and those who are economic migrants or come from countries that are safe, that they are returned back.
Because this idea the European Union came up with, they agreed really to relocate 160,000 migrants or refugees who had arrived, but that seems to have pretty much died in the water.
Yeah, I think what we really look at the European Union, that's why it's a serious situation, is a lack of confidence within European societies and between European countries. And therefore it's for the presidency now to look at very operational terms how we implement what we say. And that has three elements: the external border controls that you mentioned, that are very important to screen. Second, the issue of solidarity in Europe. And thirdly, not unimportantly, cooperation with third countries, including in Africa, Jordan and Lebanon.
Indeed, as we saw discussed already with the African Union Summit and the EU Summit at the end of December, well, indeed, a lot of European countries are starting to close their borders. We saw Sweden do so as early as last November. Sweden also now saying that it's going to increase its return of failed asylum seekers, tens of thousands of them within the next few years. Alexander Åkort reports, however, on rising violence in Sweden in relation to migrants.
Anti-immigration protesters calling for Prime Minister Stefan Löfven to resign. Under his leadership, Sweden has accepted more migrants per capita than any other European country, sparking outrage from right-wing groups.
This is a demonstration that attracts groups and individuals who sympathize with or are active in a radical nationalistic landscape. The Sweden Democrats are here, but there are also many people from different parts of this new power group that is often referred to as race ideologists.
The nation of fewer than 10 million people received 163,000 asylum requests in 2015, a number the government says is unsustainable. Sweden has now reintroduced border checks and is set to expel tens of thousands of people who don't qualify for asylum over several years. On Saturday, anti-migrant protesters called for the deportations to be accelerated. Meanwhile, some pro-migrant demonstrators said they were attacked.
We came from demonstrating, we were waiting to cross the road when I was pulled down to the ground and one of them tried to kick me in the head. But I managed to grab his foot, then the police arrived promptly and put a stop to the whole incident.
On Friday night, around 100 masked men went on the rampage at Stockholm's Sergels Torg Square, a popular meeting point for young people, including migrant youths. The group targeted foreign-looking people and handed out leaflets encouraging violence against what they called North African street children.
Mr. Kunders, we have seen, quite shocking images there in Sweden not too long ago, masked men really attacking anyone they thought was foreign. This is something that we've seen echoed in other European countries, in Germany, in the Netherlands, really a lot around asylum centres. What's to be done about this hatred really growing in Europe?
Well, first of all, it's shocking. You can never use violence against people who are in search for care. They flee terror, they flee horror, they flee Syria. And to misuse by force your character, I would almost say, and go after these people is sickening, in my view. It's simply, we have in Europe a rule of law, so these people have to be arrested, and that's the only thing that can happen. The rule of law is for everybody, for the migrants, for those who are in the country. That's the basic of European values, and there's no alternative to that.
Because perhaps the other worrying issue was this, we got a figure this week saying 10,000 children, refugee children, seem to have gone missing since they arrived into the European Union.
That is a very shocking figure. So I heard about that. I will talk this afternoon also about this in the European Parliament and with our different agencies, because can you imagine 10,000 young kids fleeing on the streets with all the risks for young girls getting into prostitution and so on and so forth. You can see that. Sometimes I feel the European Union is an institution for good weather. Now it's bad weather, and we have to be much quicker to look at this very, very serious problem, which harms a lot of young people, but will also stay with us. It's also a risk for our societies.
Now, as you say, these people, 90% of them almost fleeing terror, a lot of them fleeing war in Syria, the Islamic State group. The Netherlands recently decided to join in coalition airstrikes. You were involved already in Iraq. Now you're involved in airstrikes in Syria. Why now?
For a couple of reasons. One is that we really felt, if you looked at to the struggle in Iraq, that many of the supply lines with booby traps and so on come from Syria. And if you want to be effective with your F-16s in Iraq, you also have to target very precisely in Syria. Secondly, I think it's important, which wasn't the case before, that there is now also an international legal support for this airstrikes with the UN resolutions. And certainly there's the beginning of a political process, because bombarding itself is not going to solve the issue of terrorism or ISIS. But under certain circumstances, ISIS is an octopus. You need to prevent, you have to prevent radicalization, but it can be an element also to target in the northern part of Syria. So it's very precise what we want to do, and very much linked to this political process on the one hand. And if you look to the UN resolutions, that's what it says. It wants to get rid of the safe haven for ISIS in the north of Syria, and at the same time support the political process.
Because indeed this is where ISIS, or the Islamic State group, is based and comes out of, but it has really spread far beyond Syria's borders. I mean, we have the Islamic State group in Europe, we have it in many countries in Africa. How do we go about addressing there? We're not going to start bombing everywhere.
No, we can't bomb anywhere, and we have lessons from the past that we know that can even be counterproductive. That's why we are very specific in what we are going to do in Syria in the coalition. I think now it's necessary. The military instrument can be very useful. I see now that all these IED and booby traps and training centers are very, very negative for war making in that area. You see that many people get killed, including civilians. Yeah. But it's true that ISIS is an octopus. It can change of character. It can be in Libya, it can be in Paris. And therefore we need to work on a much larger fight, which is a fight of prevention, a fight of repression, once also of exchange of information, the whole amalgam of measures that are necessary, and where we are working hard on in Europe as well.
Sounds somewhat of an impossible task in many ways, definitely a daunting one. Something that one would hope is perhaps easier. Let's move on. Another topic on the table for Europe, notably this year, the Brexit question. We've seen a flurry of activity in recent days. Prime Minister David Cameron going to a number of countries across the Union, trying to get this reform package on the table. It will be discussed at the summit on the 18th and 19th of February. Let's take a quick look at the latest details.
Taking a tour of an electronics factory in Wiltshire, David Cameron told workers how he plans to get what he calls the best deal for Britain.
And my aim is to give Britain the chance to be in a reformed European Union. That is the aim. Why? Well, because Britain is a trading nation. We've got this market of 500 million people in Europe, the single market, a quarter of the world's economy. And Britain always has needed those markets to be open and to play a part in those markets. So if we can secure that future and deal with the problems we've had with Europe, that I think would be the best of both worlds.
The British Prime Minister and the man he's negotiating with, the European Council's president, last met in London on Sunday. 48 hours later, Donald Tusk produced a document detailing which of Cameron's reforms the EU could accommodate. National parliaments could be given more powers to block EU laws, meaning Britain could opt out of ever deeper union, a key EU principle. And Britain could request a so-called emergency brake on in-work benefits for EU migrants. Donald Tusk also said the EU should simplify legislation for businesses and safeguard the economic rights of members which don't use the euro. For Cameron, the proposals show real progress, but there's more work to do, he says. Donald Tusk's document will be thrashed out at an EU summit in 2 weeks' time. Nothing can be agreed until all 28 EU members sign it.
Yes.
Mr. Kundra, do you think globally the UK should be allowed to renegotiate, if you like, this pre-op of the Union? Is it not somewhat opening a Pandora's box for all European countries to do the same?
Well, first of all, I think it's a strategic interest of all of us that the UK remains in the European Union. But obviously within certain principles that we have. And we have the treaties, and therefore the decisions that have been made right now, or the proposals I should say, give me a certain confidence that this goes in the right direction. I'm hopeful about it, but the devil is in the details, so the Council will have to discuss that in the upcoming 2 weeks. But let's not forget, it would be, I think, a bad sign in this time of disintegration when the UK would leave the European Union. But obviously it's in the end the vote in the UK that will decide on this.
Now, they've asked for reform on 4 different areas. Yeah. Perhaps the one we focused on, in the media at least, the most is this idea of welfare benefits, an idea of an emergency brake on those. This, I believe, would be rolled out available to all countries. UK would be able to put it in place as of today, but that's concerning other European citizens, EU migrants. Surely then we're kind of knocking the values of Europe again if we can't travel freely.
As I said, the devil is there in the details. It's possible to have certain safeguard clauses, but we will have to talk to all countries, as President of the Council as well, especially Tusk will have to do that. But I think the most basic element there is non-discrimination. There has to be, we have to ensure that there's non-discrimination between the UK and other citizens. And I think that will be the yardstick with which many countries will look at this proposal. Can you see it perhaps leading to less free travel between European countries? No, I would hope not also, because this is one of the basic principles of our union. This is more about British legislation combined with certain European adaptations. And as I said, the key is non-discrimination. It should be a rule that goes for all and not only for one country.
And from the Dutch perspective, I believe one of your biggest trading partners is Britain, something like 36 billion euros exports from the Netherlands to the UK in 2014. So I'm sure you're very motivated, and perhaps more than others, to keep them in, or economically,
well,
can the EU afford to lose the UK economically?
Well, the question is, can the UK lose the European Union for its economy? I think that's even more important for the UK citizens, because they are looking at a referendum at this point. As I said, for many reasons, we think it's a good idea that the UK remains a member of the European Union, but again, not at all cost and at all price, and on the basis of the principles and the treaties that we have.
Finally, there is a referendum coming up in the Netherlands in April, I believe. This is a referendum started by the people, if you like. It concerns ideas that the European Union would have a greater, how do you call it, closer ties, really, in norms of trade with Ukraine. Something that didn't go down well among a lot of people in the Netherlands?
Well, this is a new law we have in the Netherlands, that people can call for a consultative referendum. They received the signatures, so it's a democratic instrument. The government will very much be in favor of this association agreement. I think it's important for the Ukraine. I think it's important for the Netherlands, and it's important for the European Union. So I hope the Dutch voters will support it, but we will see.
And have you an idea of the reason they'd be against it, the fear? Apparently there's a fear that it would lead to Ukraine becoming a member of the EU. And
yeah, and I expressed also on the Dutch television, and I will also do it here today, that there's no relationship between the two. An association agreement is an agreement of cooperation, not only in the areas of trade, but also in the area of border control, of police, of human rights, of anti-corruption. I can't see there's anything against that. It's not membership of the European Union.
Okay, Mr. Koenders, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. Thanks so much for joining us here on Talking Europe. That brings us to the end of this edition. Do take care.